The engineer heard the signal a few seconds before he saw the lantern. Two white arcs swung low in the sage and scrub beside the track, then crossed each other twice, the universal order to stop, while a dark figure stood with his shoulders squared at the edge of the grade. The overland flyer had been rolling easy east of Rawlins, coal smoke trailing flat under a cold June sky, when the timetable put it near a narrow timber trestle over a dry wash close to Wilcox. At 2 a.m. on June 2nd, 1899, the locomotive's headlight caught a barricade laid across the rails, ties chained together and cabled to posts, just solid enough to promise a derailment if he tried to bull through. He eased the Johnson bar, set the air, and felt the weight of the train settle into the brakes. Sparks ran under the wheels. The big engine hissed and slowed to silence. A man in a long coat climbed the steps and put a pistol on the cab crew at hip height. Another figure appeared out of the dark on the fireman's side. Both wore bandanas up to their eyes and soft hats pulled tight. The only light came from the open firebox door and the white circle of the headlamp. The gunman told the engineer to back the consist beyond the trestle. When the locomotive started to move, a third shape slipped down the tender ladder and worked the coupling lever. In a minute the head end sat alone, just the engine and tender. The rest of the train was cut loose on the far side of the little bridge. They marched the engineer and fireman off the locomotive and down the grade, boots scraping ballast. Far behind, passengers looked out of coach windows into a darkness that told them nothing. Near the trestle, the gunman shoved the two railroaders into a shallow ditch and told them to keep their heads down. One robber ran back and tossed sticks of dynamite beneath the barricade on the rails. He lit a fuse, sprinted clear, and a short blast thumped the air. The timber pile collapsed over the wash. Now the passenger cars could not cross if anyone tried to move them forward. The robbers had a clean stage with a curtain drawn behind them. They ordered the engineer to pull the engine and tender across the wash and stop just short of the express car. A masked man rolled a small bundle onto the tender, more dynamite and a coil of fuse. Another scrambled onto the roof of the express car, cut open a ventilator, and shouted down to the messenger to open up or be blown open. The messenger shouted back a refusal. Inside that car sat safes belonging to the Union Pacific and the Pacific Express Company, iron bellies that rode every long route with cash when banks and telegraph credit could not move money fast enough. The man on the roof lit a fuse and dropped the bundle into the ventilator. The blast ripped the end of the car into a ragged mouth. Splinters and paper drifted in the lamplight. The messenger stumbled out gagging on smoke, hands raised, soot in the whites of his eyes. Below, the robbers climbed through the torn side and found the big through safe still whole, bolted to the floor like a church bell. They planted more sticks. The engineer, ordered to turn his head, heard the short screaming sound fuses make, and then a flat concussion that punched his ears. The second blast tore the safe and threw metal fragments across the wreck of the car. Coins rattled like hail. Banknotes fluttered against scorched wood. From a torn pouch spilled unsigned money orders and a stacked envelope marked with a bank's name. One robber laughed once, short at the throat, then got quiet again. They worked quickly, gloved hands passing what could be carried. The leader told the firemen to bring the canvas mail sacks from the tender and fill them. The men were careful with what they took and more careful with what they left. They ignored registered letters and jewelry from passenger baggage. They loaded gold pieces and currency into the sacks and slung them over shoulders. They brought the engineer and firemen forward to the locomotive and ordered them to run it down the line a few miles. At a point the robbers liked, they told the crew to stop, then climbed off, sacks low on hips, and melted into the brush where horses waited with reins draped over the ground. At the other end of the immobilized train, someone finally walked forward along the ballast with a lantern and saw what the head end had become. Express car peeled open, air sweet with dynamite, engine idling alone. The conductor sent a flagman back down the track to protect the rear and then pushed through to the front with what men he could gather. By the time they started to move again, the robbers were gone into country that wanted them more than the railroad did. Before daylight, the Union Pacific telegraphed every town with a horse and a badge. Posses assembled in Rawlins and Laramie, then later in Casper and Medicine Bow, each convinced they were on the true scent. They had reason to be. The robbery looked like the work of the wild bunch, the loose outfit that had been cutting banks and trains from Wyoming to New Mexico under names that sounded made for posters. Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, Kid Curry, Elsie Lay, Ben Kilpatrick. Historians would argue for a century about who was present at Wilcox. The masks and the night-protected reputations as well as faces. What the newspapers had for certain was a scene. A stopped train, a blown express car, and a clean escape into badlands the gang knew as well as most men know their parlors. Pinkerton men reached Wyoming the next day. They measured boot prints beside the trestle and noted new horseshoes that would mark a trail if anyone cared to believe their field notes. They took statements from the engineer and the express messenger with a lawyer's patience and a rancher's skepticism. One of them studied the torn safe door and said the dynamite had been overdone. There was more metal in the air than anyone needed for a clean job, but admitted the effect was decisive. The rail company counted its loss in a number that moved in the papers from week to week as rumor grew. The most sober estimates ran near $50,000 in cash and coin. The pursuit found tracks that split and rejoined. At a sheep camp near Teapot Creek, a posse traded shots with riders they believed were part of the gang and lost them in folds of badland that came on like a maze. At another camp, the law seized fresh bacon and coffee and found dynamite wrappers stamped from a hardware store 2 counties away. Each small find hardened into a story in the next day's edition, and the story always had the same ending. The riders vanished toward Hole in the Wall, that cleft in the Bighorn country where every canyon runs into another, and strangers get turned around until their canteens are empty. By late June, the trail had cooled enough to make guesses look like facts. The Pinkertons wired Chicago for printing plates and sent to sheriffs a new kind of wanted sheet, studio portraits taken in Fort Worth months earlier, when 5 of the wild bunch had posed clean-shaven in suits for a street photographer who had no idea who sat in front of his lens. That photograph, passed under barroom lamps and tacked to depot walls, gave faces to names that had been only stories. It did not solve Wilcox. It did set up a string of clashes that would follow in 1900 and 1901 as the gang tried to spend and hide at the same time. Back along the Union Pacific, the railroad hardened its rules. Express messengers got more training for what to do under a pistol and what not to do under a fuse. Conductors learned to separate cars faster and to cut the head end loose if it meant saving the rest. Guards rode armed more often. The company tried new safes and new routes for cash that would make a single car less valuable to hit. None of it kept every train safe. It did change the odds in favor of a crew that might need minutes where before they had only seconds. The country made legends out of men even as it measured their work with calipers and tape. Newspapers wrote Wilcox to be read over breakfast, a cool stop in the night, a warning lantern, a blast that tore an iron safe like a thin tin box, a trio of horses blowing white in the cottonwood shade while their owners counted coin. The people who stood at the track that morning remembered a less tidy thing, a messenger holding his ears because the world was still ringing, a conductor pocketing a handful of coins scattered in the cinders because someone would ask for count later, a fireman who could smell dynamite in his hair 2 days after he washed it out. What came after for the wild bunch moved in pieces. Elsie Lay would be captured after a shootout later that summer near Carlsbad. Kid Curry would leave bodies in his wake and end with a coroner's tag years later under another name. Cassidy and Sundance would run south through South America, Letters home saying they might go straight, rumors saying they never did. None of that closed the book on a black morning in Wyoming when a team who knew where to stand and how much fire to use turned a moving train into an open cash drawer and then stepped back into the dark. Stand by the grade near Wilcox now, and you can see the replacement trestle in clean timber and the long line of track arrowing over low country. Trains pass faster and heavier than they did then. Nothing marks the spot but the feel of distance and the low earthwork at the edge of the right-of-way. If you run your boot heel through the ballast, you won't turn up a coin. The wind will be the only thing to carry a story from one side of the track to the other. But the method, the way the head end was split off, the way a fuse makes seconds count in a man's head, still reads clear enough that you can place the figures where they stood and watch the lantern arcs that ordered a stop a few heartbeats before the headlight wrote them into sight. The robbery at Wilcox lived because it showed how a small crew with a plan could lean on a great system until it gave. It was not a myth and not a song, just minutes arranged in a certain order on a night when the right men met the right train in the middle of empty country. The coins stopped ringing and the horses stopped blowing steam, and by sunrise the overland flyer rolled east, patched and late, and the town had a story that would be told for as long as there were tracks to run beside it. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.